There is an idea that quietly circulates as we grow older and start to feel less seen, less chosen. The idea that intimacy, contact with another body, emotional closeness can give us back something we believe we've lost. Importance, worth, presence. And then we begin to confuse connection with proof. To ask ourselves without saying it out loud whether we still matter, whether we still count. I've seen strong men and women lose their center right there without realizing it. Over the years, I learned that aging does not destroy intimacy. What destroys it is approaching it from fear, from comparison, from the need for validation. When you are not at peace with yourself, any closeness becomes fragile. It becomes demanding. It becomes dangerous. And that opens uncomfortable questions. What am I really looking for when I look for someone else? From where am I approaching? What emptiness am I trying to fill? My name is Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden. Next, I'm going to show you 9 silent mistakes that destroy old age without you realizing it. Mistakes I myself had to recognize late, drawing on the philosophy of the ancient Stoics to recover balance, calm, and self-respect. I'm not going to give you formulas or promises. We're going to look straight at what is usually avoided, and from there, see what kind of old age you are actually building. 1. Turning intimacy into a measure of worth. There is a quiet trap that appears as we grow older and start to feel less visible. It doesn't arrive as open desperation. It shows up as a private question that isn't always put into words, but still drives decisions. Do I still matter? Am I still desirable? Do I still have a place in someone's life? When intimacy starts being used to answer those questions, something inside falls out of order. You no longer approach from choice, but from the need to confirm that you still count. I've seen it many times, and I've lived it too. People who seek closeness not for the pleasure of sharing, but to patch a crack of insecurity. Any gesture, any kind word, any touch is accepted as if it were proof of existence. The problem is that when intimacy becomes a test you need to pass, you're no longer on equal ground. You're asking for permission to feel valuable, and that comes at a high cost. Picture a simple scene. You're sitting across from someone at a small table, maybe in a neighborhood cafe. You laugh a bit more than you normally would. You nod even when something doesn't quite convince you. You swallow a small discomfort so you don't ruin the moment. From the outside, everything looks normal. But inside, you know you're not fully being yourself. You're moving carefully, as if the connection were fragile and you were responsible for holding it together. Does that feeling sound familiar? Thinking this way is exhausting. Every gesture from the other person is read as approval or rejection. A silence becomes suspicious. A slight distance feels like a threat. And then intimacy, which should bring calm, starts to generate anxiety. The Stoics spoke often about inner command, about not handing over the rule of yourself to external things. Epictetus insisted that when you depend on what you don't control in order to feel at peace, you've already put yourself at a disadvantage, even if you don't notice it yet. There's a warning here that's worth hearing in time. If you keep using closeness as a scale to measure your worth, every future relationship will be unstable. You'll adapt too much, you'll lose your center, and little by little, you'll start to feel smaller, not more accompanied. The sentence that stayed with me over the years is simple and harsh. Intimacy that asks for validation ends up taking away respect, even your own. There is a practical tool that doesn't sound romantic, but it protects you. Before seeking closeness, pause and honestly ask yourself whether you would be okay with yourself that same night, even if the meeting didn't happen. Not to resign yourself, but to measure where you're acting from. If the answer is no, it's not the other person that's missing, it's inner support. Working on that first changes the entire dynamic. Because mature intimacy doesn't confirm your worth. It accompanies it. And if today you're approaching someone in order to feel needed, it may be worth asking which part of your life was left empty and is now asking for order. What comes next? Depends on whether you dare to look at it or keep searching for mirrors where you should really be building a foundation. 2. Choosing companionship without evaluating character. Over the years, the word companionship starts to carry more weight than it should. It's no longer just about spending some time, but about not coming home to a silence that feels too heavy. And that's where a common mistake appears, almost understandable, but dangerous. Choosing someone because they're available, because they listen, because they fill a space, without stopping to observe who they really are when they're not trying to please. At this stage of life, that's not a minor detail. It's a decision that ends up shaping the quality of your days. I've known men and women who said they were fine simply because they weren't alone, but it only took listening a little longer to notice the where. Hurtful comments disguised as humor, small manipulations, subtle disrespect that was tolerated out of fear of losing that bond. And quietly, you start to wonder whether that's companionship or just human noise occupying a place that should be reserved for something more worthy. Think of an everyday scene. You're sharing a simple meal, maybe in your own home. The conversation flows, but every so often there's a phrase that makes you uncomfortable, something that diminishes the way you live, your past, or your boundaries. It's not serious, you tell yourself, not worth arguing over. But you file it away inside. The problem is that those notes pile up and the body knows it before the mind does. You start to tense up, to measure your words, to feel less free in your own space. The Stoics placed great emphasis on character. Seneca warned that living alongside disordered people ends up disordering the soul, even if you believe yourself to be strong. He wasn't talking about judging or isolating yourself, but about choosing carefully what you allow to shape you. At this age, there's no time or energy left for relationships that slowly erode peace. Here's a clear warning. Poor companionship in old age doesn't just steal calm. It also accelerates emotional deterioration and, over time, physical decline. Because living in constant tension, even a mild one, gradually dims the spirit. And when the spirit dims, everything becomes harder. That's not exaggeration, it's accumulated experience. There's a simple tool worth using without guilt. Notice how you feel after being with someone, not during. Do you return lighter or heavier, clearer or more confused, with more respect for yourself, or with the feeling that you gave up something important? That answer is often more honest than any promise or kind gesture. Choosing companionship without evaluating character is a way of neglecting yourself. And at this point in life, taking care of yourself isn't selfishness, it's responsibility. In the next point, we're going to touch on a fear that often pushes these bad choices, one that makes many people accept the unacceptable just to avoid being alone. That fear deserves to be faced head-on. 3. Giving up boundaries out of fear of loneliness. There comes an age when fear no longer shouts. It becomes reasonable. It starts speaking with arguments that sound mature, even sensible. It tells you it's not worth arguing, that you're past conflicts, that it's better to adapt a little. And so, without drama, you begin to give ground. Not because you're convinced, but because you're tired. Tired of starting over. Tired of explaining. Tired of ending up alone when evening falls. This is where it's worth stopping for a moment and thinking slowly. Because one thing is choosing calm, and something very different is buying it at the price of your dignity. Stoicism never proposed avoiding conflict at any cost. It proposed ordering what depends on you, and your boundaries depend on you. They're not a whim. They're the line that separates coexistence from silent submission. Let me offer a simple, almost invisible scene. You're with someone you care about. They say something that makes you uncomfortable. It's not serious. It's not a direct insult, but it touches a sensitive point. Before, you might have pointed it out calmly. Today, you decide to let it slide. Not out of deep understanding, but out of fear that speaking up might break something. In that moment, it seems like you've gained peace. But that peace is false. You pay for it later when you catch yourself replaying the scene again and again, wondering why you didn't say anything. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that no one could harm him without his inner consent. But misunderstood, that phrase leads to confusion. It doesn't mean putting up with everything. It means not giving away your center. And every time you stay silent about something important so you won't lose someone, you're giving that center away. Not to the other person, to fear. I've seen older people become more and more flexible when in reality they were shrinking. They let past decisions they didn't agree with, invasions of space, demeaning comments disguised as concern. All with the idea that at this age it's not wise to be demanding. But there's a huge difference between being flexible and being permissive with what degrades you. Here appears a Stoic lesson that is rarely said directly. Loneliness is not the worst evil. The worst evil is living divided, saying one thing outwardly and feeling another inwardly. Epictetus warned that when you act against your rational nature to please or to avoid external harm, the real harm has already occurred, not outside, inside. The warning is clear and shouldn't be softened. If you give up your boundaries today so you won't be alone, tomorrow you won't even know what you need to defend. Because boundaries don't disappear all at once, they erode, and when you want to recover them, you no longer know where to begin. The other person got used to it. And so did you. The practical tool here is not immediate confrontation or imposing conditions. It's something quieter and firmer. Before accepting something that makes you uncomfortable, give yourself time. Don't respond quickly. Urgency is almost always fear in disguise. Ask yourself whether that concession will leave you at peace with yourself when you're alone. If the answer is no, that boundary has already been crossed, even if you haven't said anything yet. There's a sentence that has stayed with me for years and isn't always comfortable to hear. True companionship begins when you don't need to betray yourself to keep it. Don't take it as a closing, because it isn't. It's just a crack through which to look at the next mistake, a very common one, tied to the body, to silent neglect, and to an unfair demand we often place on relationships when we're no longer holding ourselves up. 4. Abandoning the body and demanding connection. This mistake is uncomfortable to look at because it has no glamour or epic quality to it. It doesn't speak of great traumas or complex emotional conflicts. It speaks of something more basic and more forgotten: the body. In old age, many people expect closeness, shared desire, the living presence of another, while they have gradually pushed their own body into the background, as if it no longer mattered. And that's where an unfair demand appears. Connection is asked for from ground one has already abandoned. Let me think this through with you without rushing. Intimacy is not just words or good intentions. It's energy. It's presence. It's being able to hold a gaze without tiring, a conversation without drifting away, a silence without discomfort. All of that runs through the body. When the body is neglected, stiff, overly tired, connection becomes fragile. Not because love is missing, but because support is. Picture an everyday scene, almost invisible. You wake up in the morning, and your body protests. Aches that have become routine, lack of strength, shallow breathing. You tell yourself you didn't do anything to make it worse, but you didn't do much to take care of it either. Later, you meet someone and notice it's hard to really be there. You tire quickly, you lose focus, you feel uncomfortable. And without realizing it, you begin to demand understanding, patience, adaptation from the other person, when what you're really asking for is compensation for a prior neglect. The Stoics did not separate the body from character. For them, neglecting the body also meant neglecting the capacity to live with virtue. They didn't speak of aesthetics or performance. They spoke of functionality, of being able to rely on yourself, of not becoming an unnecessary burden either to others or to your own conscience. The body, they said, is the instrument through which we live life. A neglected instrument does not produce good music. Here comes a warning that often arrives late. When you abandon your body for years and later demand deep connection, the bond tightens. The other person feels they have to carry more than is their responsibility, and you feel frustrated because you don't understand why closeness no longer flows as it once did. It's not punishment, it's consequence. I'm not talking about fitness or artificial youth. I'm talking about basic independence. Being able to walk steadily. Having enough energy to share time without exhausting yourself. Respecting yourself enough not to give in to neglect. Because when you don't treat yourself with care, it's hard for the other person to do so without resentment, even if they never say it. The tool here is concrete and possible today. Choose one daily act of physical care that doesn't depend on motivation. Walk a little more. Move your joints when you wake up. Eat with more attention. Sleep better. Not to be attractive, but to be present. The body responds when it's taken seriously, even late in the game. There's a sentence I often repeat to myself when I catch myself asking too much of another. I can't demand presence if I don't inhabit my own body. Don't take it as a closing. It's just a threshold. Because the next mistake goes even deeper. It has to do with where you place your personal worth when you seek intimacy and why that can make any bond unstable from the very beginning. 5. Basing self-esteem on others' approval. I'm going to start differently here because this mistake isn't well understood unless it's brought down to a personal level. For a while, after becoming a widower, I caught myself waiting for signs. Not big gestures, small things, a message that came first, an invitation, a look held a second longer than usual, nothing dramatic. But if it didn't happen, something in me shrank. I didn't say it out loud, but the thought was there. Maybe I'm not that interesting anymore. Maybe my time has passed. It was an uncomfortable moment to acknowledge. I bring it up because at this age we like to believe we've already outgrown the need for approval, and that's not always true. It just becomes quieter. You're no longer looking for applause. You're looking for confirmation, to be chosen, to be considered, to be needed a little. The problem isn't wanting closeness. The problem is placing your worth in how the other person responds. That's where self-esteem stops being ground and turns into a thermometer. And living like that wears you down. Let me think it through with you, slowly. When your sense of value rises or falls depending on the attention you receive, you hand over enormous power. Every gesture from the other becomes decisive. If they reply quickly, you relax. If they take time, you doubt. If they pull away, you wonder what you did wrong. And without realizing it, you start adjusting who you are so you won't lose that approval. Not because you want to deceive, but because you don't want to disappear. I remember a specific scene. I was with a woman I cared about. Nothing extraordinary. A calm conversation. At one point I noticed I was more focused on whether she felt comfortable than on whether I did. I changed the subject several times. I avoided saying something I was thinking. When I got home, the feeling wasn't connection, but exhaustion. That's when I understood something hard. I hadn't been present, I had been looking for validation. The Stoics spoke of value that comes from one's own judgment, not from another's. Epictetus insisted that when you place your well-being in someone else's hands, even without noticing it, you become dependent. Not dependent on their affection, but on their gaze. And that dependence is unstable, because the other person's gaze changes. It always does, not out of malice, by nature. Here's a warning worth hearing without defenses. If your self-esteem depends on outside approval, intimacy becomes fragile from the start. The other person senses it, even if they can't explain it. They feel a silent pressure. And deep down, so do you. Because you know that if they stop looking, something inside collapses. That's not connection. It's a precarious balance. The practical tool here isn't isolating yourself or becoming hard. It's simpler and more demanding. Start building moments of self-respect that don't depend on anyone else. Keeping your word, taking care of your body, putting order in your day. Doing what you said you would do even when no one sees it. Self-esteem isn't declared, it's built in silence. There's a sentence that helped me put this in order. Intimacy can't sustain what you don't sustain inside yourself. If today you need constant confirmation from the other, maybe what's missing isn't more closeness, but a reunion with yourself. The next mistake will touch on a dangerous comparison, one many people make in silence, and that erodes dignity without leaving visible marks. 6. Measuring yourself against the past instead of accepting the present. I'm going to come at this from a different angle, because this mistake is almost never confessed. It's lived in silence, as a constant comparison that isn't said out loud, but that accompanies every gesture. You don't compare yourself to others. You compare yourself to yourself, to who you used to be, to the body you had, to the way you looked, desired, responded. And that comparison, which seems natural, ends up being cruel. Sometimes it shows up in very simple scenes. You look at yourself in the mirror before going out. Not for long, just long enough to notice what's no longer there. Or you remember how you used to be able to hold a conversation for hours without getting tired, without losing the thread, without feeling the wear that now arrives sooner. There's no drama, but a silent conclusion settles in. I'm not what I used to be. And from there, without realizing it, you approach others with a slight sense of disadvantage. For a while, something similar happened to me. I caught myself telling stories from the past in more detail than necessary, not out of healthy nostalgia, but as a way of reminding myself, and maybe the other person, that there had been a more powerful version of me. I wasn't lying, but I wasn't fully present either. I was living supported by an unfair comparison. Unfair because no one lives today with the body, the energy, and the circumstances of 30 years ago. The Stoics were firm on this point, though they spoke without drama. Marcus Aurelius warned himself against living outside the moment that had been given to him, not out of resignation, but out of clarity. Comparing yourself to the past is fighting a lost battle, not because the present is inferior, but because it's different and it demands other virtues, more awareness, more honesty, less display. When you carry that comparison into intimacy, the damage multiplies, because you begin to believe you must compensate for what you no longer are, or you pull back, thinking you don't have as much to offer, or you exaggerate, forcing an image that doesn't match your current reality. In all cases, the connection loses truth, and without truth, any bond becomes fragile. Here's a warning many avoid hearing. Measuring yourself against your past doesn't keep you young. It keeps you divided. One part of you lives remembering. The other tries to hold the present together as best it can. And that division shows in insecurity, in rigidity, in the difficulty of enjoying what is actually available today. The practical tool here has nothing to do with denying the past or idealizing your current age. It has to do with taking an honest inventory. What do you have today that you didn't have before? Maybe more patience, more capacity to listen, more clarity about what you don't want, more emotional depth. That is also capital, and it only becomes attractive when you inhabit it without apologies. There's a sentence that stays with me when I catch myself comparing. I'm not less than before. I'm different. Don't take it as a closing. It's just a point of support. Because the next mistake has to do with silence, with what goes unsaid out of fear of discomfort, and with how that silence ends up creating distance even when there seems to be closeness. 7. Avoiding necessary conversations. This mistake isn't made out of malice or lack of intelligence, it's made out of fatigue. At a certain age, you learn to read gestures, silences, changes in tone, and you start to believe that talking too much will only complicate what still works. So you choose to stay quiet, not to deceive, but to preserve. The problem is that there are conversations you can't avoid without paying an invisible cost that grows over time. Let's think this through calmly. Not talking about expectations, timing, health, or boundaries doesn't make those issues disappear. It only pushes them into a place where they begin to act on their own. They turn into assumptions, and assumptions, when left unclarified, almost always work against you. You believe the other understands, the other believes you agree. Neither of you fully does. Imagine a very common scene. Two people who see each other often, who share affection, routines, even intimacy. But they never clearly talked about what they expect from one another. You take it for granted that certain things are respected. The other interprets your silence as flexibility. No one lies, no one imposes, but distance begins to grow anyway. Not from lack of care, but from lack of words. The Stoics understood speech as a tool for order, not as emotional release. Saying what is necessary at the right moment was a form of responsibility. Seneca warned that the most damaging conflicts don't arise from confrontation, but from what goes unsaid and accumulates. In old age, that silence weighs more because there's less room to correct long-standing misunderstandings. Here's a clear warning. Avoiding necessary conversations doesn't protect a bond. It makes it fragile. Because when something finally breaks, no one quite understands why. Everything seemed fine, but it wasn't. It was just quiet. And what's left unspoken doesn't dissolve on its own. It hardens. The practical tool here isn't arguing or demanding constant explanations. It's choosing a calm moment and putting simple words to what matters. Not long speeches, not reproaches, basic expectations, clear boundaries, concrete realities like health, available energy, the time each person can offer. Talking about these things doesn't cool a relationship, it makes it more real. Many avoid these conversations because they fear discomfort or losing the other person. But there's a discomfort that brings order and another that corrodes. Keeping silent about what's essential usually belongs to the second. And when words aren't used to clarify, the body and the spirit end up speaking instead, through distance, irritation, or fatigue. This mistake usually isn't noticed right away. It shows up later when there's already confusion, when the bond feels off without anyone quite knowing why. And then it becomes clear that it wasn't a great betrayal that damaged closeness, but a collection of silences no one dared to interrupt in time. 8. Neglecting intimate health. This mistake often hides behind a mix of modesty and denial. At a certain age, many people prefer not to look too closely at what's happening with their body on an intimate level, not out of ignorance, but because of a mistaken idea of dignity, as if paying attention to these issues were a way of admitting decline. And so checkups are avoided, signals are minimized, discomfort is normalized. The problem is that what isn't addressed doesn't disappear. It worsens in silence. Let's look at this without detours. Intimate health is not a luxury or a secondary matter. It's a direct part of autonomy. When the body begins to fail and you choose not to look, not to consult, not to speak, you start creating a future dependence that could have been avoided. Not only physical, but emotional as well. Because unresolved shame ends up creating distance, shutting down conversations, and generating misunderstandings with the other person. Imagine a common scene. Changes appear, discomfort, lack of bodily response, fatigue that wasn't there before. You notice it, but you decide not to say anything, not to a doctor, not to the person you share intimacy with. You adapt, you avoid situations, you invent excuses. From the outside, it looks like prudence. Inside, a sense of lost control begins to grow, and when control is lost, self-respect suffers too. The Stoics did not avoid the body. They accepted it as part of the fate one must manage. Marcus Aurelius spoke of the duty to care for what has been given to us while it is still in our hands, not to prolong it artificially, but not to abandon it before its time. Ignoring signals is not acceptance, it's negligence wrapped in silence. Here is a clear warning. Neglecting intimate health ends up affecting the relationship even when the other person is understanding, because lack of care creates distance, confusion, and often guilt. The other doesn't know what's happening, you don't explain, and the bond begins to move on uncomfortable assumptions that no one clarifies. The practical tool here is direct and concrete. Regular medical checkups without drama, clear information, honest conversations without unnecessary details but without concealment. Preparing yourself, asking questions, understanding what is normal and what is not. Taking care of yourself is not losing dignity, it is exercising it, especially at a stage where independence depends on small decisions sustained over time. This mistake rarely explodes all at once. It shows up as a gradual withdrawal, as a shrinking of shared space. And when one wants to return, the body is already more limited and the bond more fragile. That's why it's worth looking earlier, while there is still room to act and clarity to decide how to move forward. What comes next is not only about the body or the other person, it's about emptiness, about what you do when intimacy becomes a refuge to avoid facing your own life. That is a different, deeper mistake, and it's usually the last one to be recognized. 9. Using intimacy as an escape from emptiness. I want to start with an idea that often makes people uncomfortable because it touches something we don't always want to face. There are people who don't seek intimacy to share life, but to avoid confronting it. They don't do it with bad intentions. They do it because when they're alone, the silence feels too heavy. So closeness becomes a refuge, not an encounter. And that use, even if it brings relief at first, ends up weakening everything it touches. Let's think about this honestly. When intimacy turns into a place to hide from emptiness, from daily disorder, from lack of purpose or a routine without meaning, it's being asked to carry a role it cannot sustain. The other person stops being a companion and becomes a buffer, someone who distracts, who fills, who covers things up. And no relationship can carry that weight for long, even when there is real affection. Picture a common scene. During the day, there isn't much that gives structure to your time. The hours all look the same. There's a lack of structure, a lack of challenge, a lack of direction. But you know that in the afternoon or at night, you'll see someone. And that keeps you going. Not because the relationship is bad, but because it has become the only axis. If that meeting gets cancelled, the whole day collapses. Your mood drops. The sense of emptiness comes back strongly. That's a clear sign of imbalance. The Stoics were very careful about this, even if they didn't use these words. They spoke about not placing the weight of your life on something external that can fail. Epictetus insisted that when you turn another person into the support of your inner stability, you're putting them in an unfair and dangerous position. Not for them, for you. Because you're left without ground when that support shifts. This is a good moment to stop and ask yourself an uncomfortable but necessary question. If tomorrow that intimacy disappeared, even for a while, what would remain in your daily life? What structure would hold your days? What sense would still be standing? Not to anticipate loss, but to measure how much of your life rests on something you don't control. The warning is clear. Using intimacy as an escape from emptiness doesn't just weaken the bond. It weakens you, because it postpones work that no one else can do for you. Putting order into your time, rebuilding purpose, learning to inhabit solitude without running from it. And the longer that work is postponed, the more dependency grows, even if it's called love or companionship. The practical tool here has nothing to do directly with the relationship. It has to do with your life when no one is watching. Minimal routines, chosen responsibilities, activities that demand your presence, not to fill your schedule, but so intimacy arrives in a life that is already in motion, not in a void that needs to be covered up. When closeness grows out of an ordered life, it adds, when it grows out of a hollow space, it consumes. And this mistake is often the last one to be recognized because it brings immediate relief. But relief doesn't always mean health. Sometimes it only means that something deeper is being avoided, and that, sooner or later, demands to be addressed. If I had to leave you with a single lesson today, it would be this: old age is not ruined by time. It's ruined when you hand over the governance of your life out of fear of being alone, fear of not mattering, fear of being inconvenient. The action doesn't have to be big or heroic. It has to be concrete and now. Reclaim a boundary. Take a little better care of your body. Speak a necessary truth. Put order into a routine. Choose better. That is Stoicism lived, not just thought about. My name is Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden. This channel exists to accompany you in aging with dignity, independence, and inner calm. We're not here to feel better for a moment. We're here to become stronger on the inside. If this content helped you, I invite you to subscribe, to share it with someone who might need it, and to leave a comment writing, "I am a Stoic." I read all the comments, and it truly matters to me to know from which part of the world you're listening. Leave your country as well. Knowing where you are reminds me that we're not alone on this stretch of the road. We keep walking together, with calm, with firmness, with respect for who we still are.